Hi guys, welcome back and thank you for joining me today. Over the last few days, maybe a week or so, I've had a lot of people ask me questions about a topic of responsibility and how to deal with people who are not taking responsibility or not taking ownership of things. And I've been planning to shoot this video to talk about what I'm going to talk about today for quite a while, but it's just kind of all culminated all at once here. So I'm going to run through a few things that can help us identify when somebody or whose responsibility something is, and once we identify whose responsibility it is, then we can also identify if somebody is not taking responsibility or if I'm not taking responsibility, because I do that from time to time. So first off, I want to point out Proverbs 13:10 that states, without pride, or only by pride, comes contention. So another way of paraphrasing this verse is to say that the only time that issues come up, or a problem arises, or there's a crisis, is if you remember back to when we talked about the humility stick. It's one stick, two extremes on either end, and the center is humility. And the center, being humility, is acting in and believing about myself what God says about me, and how God sees me, and how God accepts me. And if I'm on either end of that stick, one of the two extremes, doesn't matter which one, I'm in pride. And this verse, Proverbs 13:10, says that when somebody's on either end, either extreme of that stick, there's going to be problems, there's going to be contentions, there's going to be strife, there's going to be arguments, there's going to be things that need to be resolved, and conflicts that need to be solved, and resolutions that need to be made. And so that's kind of how problems come up and come into our lives. But how do we identify who's responsible? How do we identify who needs to take ownership of what part? Well, first let's look at what different parts there are. So in every problem, it's more than one person. There's always a problem is brought to the surface because there's multiple people. So if there's multiple people, well, there's multiple people that need to take responsibility or take ownership. So there's usually one person who instigated an issue, said something wrong, said something mean, said something unthoughtfully, and overall was unloving or disrespectful. And it's up to that person to take ownership for their part. It doesn't matter if it's only 5% of the overall issue. It doesn't matter if it's 99% of the overall issue. It's their responsibility. It's it's what they have to do to facilitate a healthy relationship is to own that, to say, yes, I messed up. Meanwhile, there's another person involved. We'll say this is just two people here, and the other person who was not the person who instigated the problem, but they are the person that reacted to it. Now, this person may have, brushed off the other person as, it's just their issue, but, doing that can be unloving and disrespectful in and of itself as well. So this person may have, just said, hey, that's your problem. Don't talk to me about it. They may have shut out the other person. They may have just simply went on with life, or they may have engaged in unloving and disrespectful communication. And this could be, verbal communication, it could be physical communication, it could be any number of things. But maybe they shouted back at the other person, or maybe they called the other person, mean or cruel or unloving or selfish, started name calling and trying to shame the other person. And it doesn't matter if this person has, 5% of the blame. Doesn't matter if they have 99% of the blame. It's up to that person to take full responsibility, take full ownership, and say, hey, how I reacted to you, it was wrong. And it's up to both people involved, or if there's more than two people, it's up to everybody involved to apologize, to do what they can to acknowledge, hey, what I did was wrong. I wasn't thinking about you. I'm sorry. And then it's up to both parties to forgive and choose to forget and choose to move on. Now, it doesn't mean that problem wasn't was automatically just pushed under the rug or gotten rid of, evaporated. There still might be tensions, but it's a choice from the parties involved to continue moving on. So what happens if somebody doesn't take responsibility? Well, if somebody doesn't take responsibility for what they did, then it's up to me to have good boundaries, to have good limits on what I choose to do, how I choose to respond, how I choose to react. And really, this is kind of a rabbit trail here, but I like the word respond better than I like the word react. I like it more because responding has in it's taking time to think about what I'm doing, whereas reaction is a little bit more like a reflex. If you tap your knee in the right spot, your leg will just kick out. That's a reflex. You don't think about that. Your brain doesn't think about it like, oh, something's hitting my knee, I need to kick to get it away from me or get away from it. No, it just happens. It's kind of like when something, say a raindrop comes at your eye, you blink and you feel it hit your eyelid, but you never thought about, oh, I should close my eye. So that's a rabbit trail. I like responding versus reacting because it implies that I am thinking about what's going on. I'm thinking about what was said, what was done, and I'm thinking about, okay, how can I respond to this person who I might have some tensions with, who, we might be in the middle of a dispute, but how can I respond in a loving and respectful way? Well, first off, I have to acknowledge whatever is my responsibility. I have to acknowledge whatever I need to take ownership of. So if I, made a face while they were talking, if I, rolled my eyes, if I, said something that was really kind of either snarky or, maybe immature or, sarcasm too. Sarcasm can erode at relationships because sarcasm really hides vulnerability. Sarcasm doesn't allow the real me to be seen. Now, sarcasm is great and it can be fun, in the right setting, with the right people. And, anytime there's a more serious discussion, it'd probably be best to leave the sarcasm out of it unless you and the other person have a mutual understanding of, sarcasm just lightens the mood. So either way, whatever I have done, I need to be able to be present and aware enough to acknowledge that, I did that. And then I got to think, looking at myself again, think like, okay, I didn't want to do that, but I did it. So I own it. And now I've hurt this other person. Now I'm part of the problem because I've just added to the hurt. I've added to the tension that has happened. And I got to do whatever, the situation requires to be able to show that person that I've hurt now that I'm sorry for what I did, that I wasn't thinking about them, but I'm thinking about them now, that I am accepting of them, that I forgive them for what they did. Now, no matter what their response is, whether they accept your love, whether they accept your forgiveness, whether they accept, even the fact that you're just trying to reach out to them, or if they don't, I've got to have the self-control or also the calm confidence to just kind of be even-keeled and to not let it bother me. I've got to know, I've got to be grounded in who God says I am. I've got to be grounded in my identity. I've got to be grounded in knowing, who I am at the core of my being and not let what anybody else does shake me. Now this ties into boundaries as well because, I can't really set boundaries if I don't know who I am. But once I know who I am and I know where I'm going, I can set boundaries and limits on myself that say, okay, they're being disrespectful. I'm not going to participate in that. If it's something that I need to communicate with on this other person about, I might have to set a boundary and say, I will stay in this conversation or in this discussion as long as it stays respectful. Refer back to the video on boundaries. And also, another thing I found is taking on responsibility that is somebody else's. This is after I've analyzed the problem and it's not that I'm assigning blame to myself or assigning blame to another person, but it's being aware, being awake to, who is responsible for this aspect, who is responsible for bringing this to the table, or who is responsible for bringing the axe or the hatchet, or maybe it's a nuclear bomb. Who's responsible for that? If it's me, I'm taking ownership of it. I'm acknowledging it, not only to myself, but also to the person that I hurt because of what I brought to the table. And I'm going to them and I'm apologizing and stating specifically what I'm apologizing for. And then my actions, I make sure that they line up with my words. So whatever my words say, my actions follow. But what I found is if somebody doesn't take responsibility, maybe they're ignorant. Ignorance can be fixed. They just need to be educated, and I might not be the one to do that. So likewise, you might not be the one to educate the other person, but just maintain good boundaries. And, if somebody doesn't recognize or doesn't want to admit that they brought something to the table that hurt me, then, it's not my responsibility necessarily to point it out to them, but it's my responsibility to maintain a good, safe connection as much as relies on me. And anytime that I start trying to take on responsibility that is other people's, it's not a responsibility that I own, but it's something else that, somebody else is responsible for. Anytime I try to solve that, anytime I try to take that up as my own, I find that I get frustrated. I find that I lose peace. I lose somewhat of the ability to function at my full capacity. I'm just not at ease. I would say the word disease, but it's not necessarily a physical disease. It's more of a dis-ease in my mind. I'm trying to solve something that does not belong to me. And if I come across that, what I do is I take a step back, make sure I owned everything that I can, like everything that is on me in this situation. I own it and I handle it as well as I can, no matter how it's received. And then after I've identified, who the problem belongs to, then I can try to help and guide them. I can try to talk with them and listen to them and ask them, good questions about has anything like this ever happened to you before? If so, what have you done in the past that has worked? If you've never been up against something like this before, what do you think you'll do? What do you think you should do? And then I can ask, how do you think that'll work for you? Do you think you'll get the result you're looking for? And after I've done that, kind of opened up, and then I can also share, empathy of something or some time that I've been through something similar. And once I've connected in that way, then I can ask them, if they're open to it or seemingly open to it, I can ask them, may I share some advice? And then I could share, what has worked for me and what I have seen bring peace back into my life. But anytime I take on their responsibility, during all of that, I get frustrated and I am often then irritated with the person that I am taking the responsibility from and not allowing them to take ownership, not allowing them to have the respect for themselves. So, just kind of in closing here, get good at identifying, okay, who owns this aspect of the problem? Every problem is going to have more than one owner, but there's different parts of each problem that the individual owners need to own and take responsibility for. And look at yourself, make sure that you've covered everything you can. Don't take on other people's responsibility. Don't enable them to pass off responsibility, to pass off ownership of things. Even if it's as simple as taking the trash out, it's a chore. But if they know that somebody's going to enable them to shirk their responsibility, chances are they're going to follow that route. And it's the same way in relational disputes. It's the same way in arguments in marriages. It's the same way in workplace environments. If there's if there's an enabler present, chances are that person is going to be stuck being forced into situations where they feel like they have to own other people's belongings. And the belongings I'm talking about here are, problems and whatnot. But anyway, so respect yourself enough that you don't become an enabler. Respect yourself to the point where, I am going to live at peace with all men as much as depends on me. And, be you, but also be thoughtful, be courteous, be kind, but also be tough. Kindness actually has a toughness to it, and that is the boundaries and the limits that I've talked about. So don't take on responsibility that's not yours. Look at yourself, see if you're frustrated because you are taking on responsibility for something else. And a sure way to tell that is, if I am working harder on somebody else's problem than they are working on it, I've taken ownership of their problem. I've taken responsibility away from them. And if you find that you've done that, give the responsibility back. Figure out a good way to do that, a good way that doesn't just drop a bomb on them in turn, but, figure out how to give it back. So, look at who is the owner of the problem, or who are the owners of the individual parts of the problem, and, go out and be a whole, healthy person, take ownership for what's yours, and don't take responsibility, don't take ownership of what's not yours. So there's going to be a few questions to follow, and I'll see you back here again.